Welcome back. All right, so if I'm going to get into hockey history, and I've talked about the NHA, I do have to talk about the PCHA. The PCHA laid the groundwork for a lot of the rules we now have in the National Hockey League. It had hockey rinks that were 200 by 85 feet, and that became the standard. So it was founded December 7th of 2011 by the brothers, Frank and Lester Patrick, and they are considered pioneers of the game. Lester Patrick himself having played every position, including the rover position. The PCHA did keep the rover. 6 players on the ice, plus a goaltender. And the rover, as I said in the NHA video, would support the forwards and the defensemen. And remember, you're not dealing with line changes. You're dealing with guys out on the ice for most of the game. And so that extra player, that rover, a little bit of oomph it might give your team. And then when we had playoff series between the NHA and the PCHA, they would alternate rules like Major League Baseball does. Just think like you've got the designated hitter rule in baseball. And so, it goes back and forth. You'd have a game between the two teams, and if PCHA was hosting it, they had home ice advantage. You would have a rover out on the ice. So the 7-man hockey with the rover is one thing. Of course, the NHA did away with that. And there was a new arena in Vancouver which held 10,000 fans. Now, by today's standards, that's not a lot, but back then, that was the record in Canada. That was the largest arena, and so Vancouver had a little bit of something going on there. And Vancouver was really a power of the PCHA. January 2nd of 1912, the first PCHA games played. The Victoria Aristocrats, who went through a few different name changes along the way, they hosted the New Westminster Royals in the league's first game, drawing 2,500 to an arena that held 4,000. So, not bad to have 2,500 for your league's first ever game. And New West won that game 8-3 over Victoria. New Westminster Royals is a name I remember from when I was a kid, so it's kind of fun doing a video talking about the PCHA, and you could find echoes in Western Canada back to the PCHA. But of course, the NHL survived that battle, right? In 1914, Victoria, they win the league, and they're like, all right, we won the league. We're going to go challenge the Cup champions. But challenging the Cup champions wasn't like something you'd see in a movie where they just show up and, come on, let's go, and then they have a game. Nope, that's not the way that works. So there was a formal process for challenging for the Stanley Cup, and Victoria did not fill out the paperwork necessary. And so the committee that decided on whether or not the Stanley Cup was going to be played for said, no, you didn't follow the formal process, so you're not going to challenge for the Cup. So Victoria lost their chance at a Stanley Cup. They would win one later, but yeah, Stanley Cup challenge not accepted. So back to Victoria with you. It's a bit of a trip. So the NHA and the PCHA fought over players. And at one point in time, it got so ugly because the PCHA was raiding the NHA for players, as both leagues were struggling financially as well. So that had to be frustrating the NHA. And so the NHA, which became the NHL later, they declared all PCHA players fair game. They said they're all free agents, all of them. You can get anybody you want from the PCHA. So it was an issue. Absolutely an issue that the PCHA and the NHA were fighting over players, and the NHA wasn't necessarily fighting fair. And of course, the NHL would do that with others that challenged their league, or just Eddie Livingstone later on. Cyclone Taylor is probably the most recognizable name, and again, I'm saying for West Coast fans of hockey, Cyclone Taylor of the Vancouver Millionaires was arguably the first hockey superstar. Widely known of player that everybody liked. He was a goal scorer, he was a winner, and so Cyclone Taylor absolutely seen as, and again, I think the first superstar in hockey history. April 6th of 1926, Victoria loses the Cup final to the Maroons. That was the final game contested for the Stanley Cup between the NHL and a team outside the NHL. It's never happened again. I don't think it ever will happen again. Just imagine if the WHA had challenged for the Stanley Cup. Just imagine if during the 70s they said, all right, we'll do that over Clarence Campbell's dead body. Not going to happen. We'll get to Clarence Campbell and all that at a later date. But I think it's a fun idea. I mean, I know no team could really knock off the Stanley Cup champions, but I still think it's a fun idea to have like as an exhibition. But to decide the Stanley Cup, probably not. So the league champions, the New Westminster Royals, won that first year in 1912. Eventually, the team would have to suspend operations, money. The Victoria Aristocrats in 1913 and 1914 won the league. 1915, the Vancouver Millionaires won it, and they won the Stanley Cup that year as well. So in the NHA video, I didn't go through and do all my due diligence. There were 2 Stanley Cups that were won by PCHA teams over those NHA teams that won the league. So the Vancouver Millionaires won it in 1915. 1916, the Portland Rosebuds won it. And 1917, the Seattle Metropolitans won the Stanley Cup. So kudos to them for that, because this was definitely not an easy thing to do when PCHA played against the NHA. So 1918, you're now into the NHL. The NHL period starts with 1917-18. Vancouver Millionaires won the league that year. The Seattle Metropolitans won it in 1919 and 1920. 1921 through 24, Vancouver wins it. The Millionaires the first 2 years, and the Vancouver Maroons the second 2 years. So, yeah, you had a Maroons in Montreal, and you had a Maroons in Vancouver as well. Then the league disbanded in 1924. They just weren't making money. They were having trouble. So the Vancouver Maroons and the Victoria Cougars joined the West Coast Hockey League, which would become the Western Hockey League. Victoria Cougars win in 1925 and also won the Stanley Cup. 1926, as previously mentioned, they won the league, but they lose the Stanley Cup final against the Montreal Maroons. And so it was quite the run for the PCHA, but eventually it becomes what everything becomes: money. They didn't have the money. There was no way that this league could compete with the NHA. They survived the war. They could not survive the 1920s. And as we go through the NHL's history too, the 1920s almost did the NHL in. There were some touch and go times in the 1920s where it seemed like the money just wasn't there. They got through by the skin of their teeth, but yeah, it was tough. The PCHA, though, did innovate the game, and a lot of this is credited to Lester Patrick. And when you've played the game at every position, all 3 forward positions, rover, defense, both sides, I guess, as well as in goal, you might have a good idea for what the game needs. They brought in the blue lines. They also brought in goal creases. So the original ice surface was just the I don't even know if they had the red line down the middle, to be honest. I think they did, just to measure who was in which zone. But it was a very blank ice surface. Remember, you're not going to see any ads on the boards, no ads on the ice. How would you even know there's a hockey game? Forward passing, they started that. Forward passing wasn't allowed. And eventually the NHL would allow forward passing in all 3 zones. But forward passing, the PCHA was ahead of them there. Penalty shots were allowed in the PCHA first. And the idea of a playoff system, the PCHA had that first. And then the NHA would have one. Of course, the NHL would continue that after. They allowed goalies to leave their feet. I've talked about this in history videos before, too. Initially, goalies weren't allowed to fall down to make a save. Just imagine how that would look in today's game. Just imagine telling NHL goaltenders like Saros, any of them really, Shesterkin, guys who are really acrobatic, tell them, okay, you got to make saves, but you're not allowed to leave your feet. You have to stay standing the whole time, or it's a penalty. Yeah. So goalies would like accidentally fall over. That was just, oh, whoops, I fell down. Oh, I saved the puck. And so eventually, I think the NHL realized how silly that looked. But the PCHA was ahead of them on that and was like, yeah, we've got to allow goalies to leave their feet to make a save. They were also the first league to expand into the U.S. Eventually, the NHL gets there, but the PCHA was there first with a team in Portland, which eventually, for financial reasons, didn't work. But I'm a big fan of Portland, of the idea of Portland having a team. I don't know if Rosebuds would work as a name for the team if they did come back, but I'm a fan of that idea. And this is also for people who and I saw this when Seattle got an expansion team. Well, Seattle, what's their hockey history? Long, storied hockey history, and then the question becomes, so if they'd come back into the league as the Metropolitans instead of as the Kraken, which would have been confusing because there's a division called the Metropolitan Division, do they get that Stanley Cup back? No. The answer is no. But anyways, they did. They also had a farm system in the PCHA. They understood the development thing again ahead of the NHA there, and they added numbers to player sweaters. The sweaters that they wore initially, there were no numbers on the back. I can't imagine how weird it'd be to watch hockey where you have no blue lines. You have nothing on the boards. It's just this blank sheet of ice. I don't even. They didn't paint the ice back then either. So yeah, the ice is going to be kind of that just bland color, and yeah, not even a number on the back of the sweaters. And almost every team too had the stripy look too. It's just I can't imagine. And Frank and Lester wanted to form a women's league. They were about a century ahead of where the eventually PWHL comes in now. But they wanted to form a women's league. They were never able to make that happen. And with the amount of financial issues the PCHA had, I don't think a women's league would have gone very far. But it is interesting to see one as far back as in the 1920s, where they're like, yeah, we should form one with women in it as well. They did put a couple of teams together. They tried. It just didn't work. So they were ahead of their time. The PCHA definitely helped to form the hockey we have now, but they just couldn't compete with the NHL. The NHL was just getting too big and too powerful, and PCHA owners were losing money. So some of the players from the PCHA and some of the ownership from the PCHA end up in the NHL. One interesting note is that in 1926, the Victoria Cougars, there's an expansion team in Detroit. And hey, look at this. The West Coast Hockey League's having financial struggles and going out of business. So the Detroit owners of this new expansion team in Detroit bought the players from the Victoria Cougars. Some of the players anyways. I don't think it was all of them. And they used Cougars as the name. That's why initially it was the Detroit Cougars. It then became the Detroit Falcons before they changed the name to the Detroit Red Wings. So it is an interesting history that they have. And again, it does have ties directly in with the National Hockey League game that we watch and enjoy now because of some of these rule changes and policy changes that the NHL adopted later and realized they were a pretty good idea. Just imagine the league without a blue line. Yeah, I can't. It'd be a completely different game. Or without forward passing. Yeah, bonkers. Anyways, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you've not done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.